now like to call forward Graeme Stewart, who I've never met before. But when he sent me his bio, the first thing I noted was he has 5 sets of letters after his name, which tells me he is both accomplished and busy. He is principal with ERA Architects and a founding director of the Center for Urban Growth and Renewal. A key part of Graeme's work has been Tower Renewal, a multi-sectoral initiative focused on the low-carbon future for the thousands of mid-century tower blocks we see all over Toronto. And it was really this work and much of his other work as well, that he was awarded the 2014 Jane Jacobs Award. Away you go, Graeme.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. And thanks, Jeremy, to organizing this fantastic conference, and to Martine for that great presentation, which I think works really well with this one. So the focus of my work and my colleagues' work is these buildings. And I'm an architect, so my focus really is bricks and mortar. How do you fix them up? What does it cost to fix them up? What are the logistics in doing that? But really for the focus of how do you do that and keep them affordable? And it's really looking at this growing paradox where how do you bring capital to buildings and keep rents flat? You know, it's a very complicated public policy challenge. We've inherited these buildings from a different era, and we're very lucky to have them. So a part of the work and a lot of the advocacy over the last 10 years is let's just make sure we hold on to them and we keep them and they don't go anywhere. And a lot of this has really been supported by the National Housing Strategy, as Greg mentioned and we'll get into, but also the research from that strategy dug up important tidbits like this. 76% of Canada's purpose-built rental is over 36 years old. Really, when you look into the numbers, it's closer to 60 or 50% is more than 60 years old. We built a lot of purpose-built rental housing and then we stopped. So we really have to hold on to what we have. And so during that sort of period, and there's a whole sort of set of discussions we can have about how this came to be, that we built things like this. You know, that looks almost like a Soviet landscape or something. But in Toronto and in Canada, through a whole mix of things, we built massive amounts of rental very, very quickly. And in this image, about 100% of what you're seeing was privately developed. So it was a mix of supply side incentives from the federal government, very favorable zoning by the city, and a policy that was really just saying, we want to build a lot of this and we're going to deliver it through the private sector. So it's sort of a strange phenomenon that was pervasive in Canada, which is different than other places where this form of housing was mostly public. But it really was a public-private partnership in terms of policy direction and private building, and a massive amount of it. And this is some statistics from the last census. So this is all looking at all high-rise units throughout Canada at different CMAs. And so what we're looking at is this pie chart here. And so the navy is the housing that we're interested in, sort of the older rental, which is more than half of all purpose-built rental. Or no, sorry, this is all high-rise housing. So the purpose-built rental is really what you see in the navy. The rest is different condo. So there's 1.3 million high-rise units in Canada, about 700,000 plus purpose-built rental. And what's interesting is that it was almost all stopped being built in about 1984 when Mulrooney came in with some tax changes, which really made it a disincentive for the private market to build it. And what that means is if you think of this cities like Toronto or Winnipeg or elsewhere, they were a lot smaller then. So this was a much larger percentage of the housing stock than it is today. So that same, it really is the backbone of the purpose-built rental system, and it's doing a lot of heavy lifting as our cities grow. It was also tied to a lot of what we look at it as progressive planning policies. Usually when you look at buildings from the 60s, people sort of think of them as horrible and terrible, but they were linked with locations of schools and jobs and parks, and they were comprehensively planned, and it really was this era that we kind of look on with a little bit of envy. All the aesthetics have changed, and we build them differently today. There was quite a major ambition into how these things grew and were together. And then this is some of the advertisements from the private buildings of these, some of the owners, the ones that have now been bought up by the companies that Martine was discussing. But they were also very attractive. So this idea of the social housing that was built was actually to be to the aspiration of what the private sector was doing. So usually we think of these buildings and we think there's sort of black and white photos and seeing them as a negative place to live, when really the history of these buildings is it was kind of like the Jetsons had arrived and these were fabulous places to live and it was very exciting. And the city went from a sort of Victorian backwater to a modern city very quickly. And one of the reasons that the rents were relatively affordable really was for the massive amount of supply and also the supply side subsidies that went through it. And then, of course, this started to happen en masse through the 1970s. So attitudes changed. A lot of the public stock was threatened. It's happened here at Regent Park. But really, because most of this is sort of a bit of a paradox, but because most of our stock is private, we haven't lost it, where the public housing has been threatened all over the world because of political decisions. So there's sort of an interesting paradox there. So Tower Renewal has been really looking for the last 10 years, working with the city and the feds and the province and saying, we need to hold on to this housing, and how do we leverage it and get over some of our cultural biases that might think that, we don't like this type of housing, or it's there really was a lot of stigma associated with it, which I think has changed quite dramatically, that now we're in the position that we are. It's really become crucial, and people realize how important it is to have. And there's 3 pillars to the work. One is eco-retrofits and state of repair, social and economic life in these buildings, and then where appropriate, neighborhood transformations that could bring more housing and more affordable housing to some of these areas. And so the work we're doing really looks at improving housing quality while maintaining affordability. That's why we're here today, and that is the paradox. Achieving complete communities in tower neighborhoods, mitigating climate change through building retrofits, and integrating tower neighborhoods to growth and transit planning, which really hasn't yet quite happened to date. But what we're really focusing on is state of repair. This is getting more and more urgent, as Greg mentioned. Typically in Ontario or in Canada, the way we do this, up until now, really has been something's broken and you fix it. And it's a like-for-like replacement, and it's really plugging leaks. But that's not actually providing resilience, the resilient 21st century housing that we need. People are really living in sometimes substandard conditions. And of course, we're sort of seeing the tip of the iceberg with the failures at St. Jamestown and elsewhere. This is a building where 1,000 families had to be evacuated, put huge pressure on the housing system. We can't afford to have 1,000 units go offline. That was just one building. What happens if 10 buildings happened? So we really need to invest in the state of repair of this housing, especially in the worst stock of it. As architects, we do a lot of work on these buildings, so we really know the state that they're in. It's quite complicated and quite expensive to bring these buildings up to par. Part of it is the base flow of keeping it just going, but then how do you bring it to give it another 50 years and to have it meet our current standards and objectives? So there's quite a lot to learn from around the world. A lot of the work, I just got back from Germany last week, really looking at where this has happened. And of course, in the European Union and the unification of Germany, a lot of investment happened in this housing. So there's quite a lot to look from to say, what can this housing look like, giving another 50 years life, and how do we go about doing it? This is looking at just one metric, which is GHG reductions, which has been quite topical. The typical retrofit, an owner would do in maybe 10% reductions. How do we get up to 90% reductions? But with doing that, ensuring they're actually doing tenant comfort, thermal controls, adequate ventilation, life safety measures like sprinklers, all that stuff that actually makes it resilient housing and not just carbon cutting for the sake of carbon cutting. So this is a lot of the work we're doing, looking at how that works. And after Grenfell, I was actually in London when that happened, was able to meet with the fire marshal and some of the people at the city. We took on a study that compared Canadian codes to German codes and actually found that while our fire codes are good, there is no retrofit code in Canada. And what that means is that you could do a retrofit and actually create mold risk, health risk, ventilation risk, and other things if you actually don't do it properly. So that's quite a bit of the work that our organization is working on right now, which is looking at to what standard should we be doing retrofits and how do we ensure that we don't have disasters. Well-intended disasters. The other thing that's interesting is that there really is a change. 10 years ago, people were uninterested in this housing, and now it's extremely topical globally. So the Mies van der Rohe Prize is the world's most prestigious architecture prize, which the last 2 years in a row has gone to the rehabilitation of tower block housing in Europe, the bottom in Amsterdam, the top in Bordeaux, with really amazing results. And so we've been quite pleased that the former provincial government, through Cap and Trade, put about $600 million into social housing repair, which kickstarted a whole series of retrofits. A lot of them got canceled when the Ford government came in, but the ones that are under construction, it's a lot of important work. And of course, the National Housing Strategy earmarking about $15 million towards the co-investment fund with the aim of the retrofit of 200,000 units. So this is a total sea change in the thinking around this. And this is a project that we're working on, one of many. This is in Hamilton, and it'll be North America's first passive house retrofit. So that's why we're in Germany working with our colleagues. So 90% energy reductions, but it's a seniors building, converting 30% of units to accessible units for aging in place, and very low, deep affordable rents. But and this is something that's interesting. We're actually modeling and designing the building for a 2050 climate scenario, assuming what will the temperature be, and how do we do cooling and heating in that scenario. Just wrapping, I'm getting the finger. It's not that finger. And so with this, the positive side of this is that we're able to really test and expand the retrofit market in terms of trades, in terms of products, to bring costs down, to actually be able to say, how do you do deep retrofits in a building with existing tenants? It's extremely difficult. And right now our market's not quite up to the task because we haven't been doing it. So these are other projects around the world that we're learning from. And this first example is really looking at how do you have retrofit specific techniques and respect for tenants while you're doing this. So there's that funding really tied to nonprofit housing and social housing has been crucial. The real challenge, though, and this is sort of the topic that gets into the previous presentation, is that such a small percentage of our housing is in the social housing and nonprofit sector. So the NHS and other tools are tailor-made for those types of owners to do this type of investment. All the projects we're working on are social housing or nonprofit housing. But when you get into the for-profit housing and the sort of different owners, none of the present tools that are provided by the feds make sense. They just don't fit into that financialized model, so they're not taking them up. So how do we create a tailored set of tools that would work? And then just wrapping up, I'm sorry, Jeremy. This is looking at the different levels of retrofit with a study that we just finished, about $100,000 a unit to do a really deep retrofit as compared to building new, which is about $250,000 per unit. Left to market forces alone in private housing without raising rents, this is about the market ceiling. So the paradox being, how do you actually bring capital to buildings to improve them without raising rents in the context that we have? So there's low interest loans, there's grants, there's a whole bunch of other things that we could work with, but we haven't quite designed them yet where we're getting uptake and we're getting the results we're looking for. So I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.